5 Apache
Howdy,
widows
ladies.
knocked on his
Looks like
door
we got
and
ourselves
changed
a
the
bit of a
rancher's life
situation
forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late November of 1878 came colder than any year Thomas McAllister could remember. Frost clung to the grass before the sun had even risen, and the wind off the high ridges of Silver Creek carried the bite of deep winter weeks too soon. Thomas had already sealed his windows with oiled cloth and stacked the last cords of firewood against the cabin wall. He expected no visitors. He never did. The nearest town lay nearly 12 miles downhill, a hard ride even in fair weather, and now the trail was half buried in snow and stone. The closest neighbor had passed away the previous spring, leaving Thomas alone with his goats, his tools, and the silence that stretched heavier than the storm clouds gathering above. The cabin itself was solid, hewn by his own hands 6 years earlier when he turned his back on men and their endless quarrels. He had once worked as a translator, moving between Spanish, Comanche, and English, called upon whenever landowners or officers wanted treaties signed without the spilling of blood. But blood came anyway, too much of it. He had seen young mothers shot down in panic, children torn screaming from their families, elders left in the dust beneath their blankets. He had tried to speak, to stand between one tongue and another, but no one wanted to listen. Words, it turned out, could not stop a bullet. So Thomas walked away. He left behind the camps, the forts, the ranches with their hungry boarders, and carried only what he could build with his own hands. The cabin became his refuge, the hills his company, the silence his only companion. Now, as he split another round of pine behind the cabin, the rhythm of his axe echoed through the stillness. He worked not for distraction nor strength, but because winter was long, and fire devoured wood quicker than memory devoured peace. His gloves were worn through at the fingertips, his boots cracked at the heel, yet he pressed on. Inside, a pot simmered slowly on the stove, waiting to become stew. For Thomas, this was enough. This was survival. Nothing more, nothing less, or so he believed, until that winter evening when the silence changed. The axe was mid-swing when Thomas froze. At first, he thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but this sound was steadier, softer, and undeniably human. Footsteps, several of them. He straightened, hand brushing against the revolver at his belt, but not drawing it just yet. No one should be on this ridge, not in weather like this. He stepped around the cabin, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow, and scanned the edge of the clearing. That was when he saw them. 5 figures stood among the trees, silent and still, their shapes blurred by frost and fading light. They had no horses, no wagon, nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their feet were wrapped in rags stiff with ice, their dresses torn, patched with leather, worn thin by travel. Blankets hung from their shoulders, more like shrouds than garments. One stepped forward. She carried herself with a strength that no hunger or storm could erase, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, her gaze level and unflinching. Her lips cracked from cold, but her voice was steady. "We need shelter," she said in plain English, her accent heavy but clear. "Only one night." Thomas said nothing. His eyes swept over the group. Behind her, the youngest swayed on her feet, a stain of blood running down her calf into the snow. Another woman cradled an arm as if it were broken. One clutched a threadbare sack, the only possession left to her name. These were not wanderers. These were survivors. He glanced past them into the timberline, expecting to see riders, soldiers, or worse. Nothing moved. No cavalry patrol, no bounty hunters. Just the wind and the snow. The memory of another time flared in his mind. 3 years ago, when he had let a stranger inside. A trapper on the run who drank away Thomas's stores, stole his best horse, and left him bound in the barn for a day and a half. Trust had cost him dearly. But these were not men. These were women who bore the marks of pursuit, loss, and desperation. Their posture was proud, but their bodies were failing. Thomas exhaled, long and heavy, before unlatching the gate to his yard. He didn't speak, only stepped aside. They entered slowly, one by one, their eyes flicking to him as they passed. He caught the scent of pine smoke tangled with the sharper metallic tang of blood on their clothes. Among them was an older woman, tall, hips broad, her lined face carved by years. She did not thank him, not yet. Inside, the cabin was dim, the fire in the stove sinking low. Thomas threw on another log, stirred the pot of stew, and ladled out what little remained from the night before. He set the bowls in front of them without a word. They gathered around the hearth, hands extended to the warmth, eating in silence. The leader, the dark-haired woman who had spoken, sat close to the fire, her dress torn at the chest, the fabric once stitched but split open again. Sweat from fever glistened on her skin, though she did not hide it. Thomas felt his throat tighten, not from desire, not from shame, but from anger. Who had done this to her? The youngest, trembling, held her bowl with both hands. She made no sound, no complaint, only swallowed each mouthful as though it were a prayer. They had not come begging. They had come because there was nowhere else left. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight of silence shift into something else entirely. Responsibility. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The door groaned on its hinges as Thomas pushed it open. He stood aside without speaking, his hand still close to the revolver at his hip. The women hesitated in the threshold, wary as wolves, before stepping into the dim light of the cabin. The warmth of the stove barely reached the corners. Smoke curled through the rafters, the air thick with pine and old leather. One by one they entered, dripping snow onto the wooden floorboards. Thomas noticed how they carried themselves, not broken, not begging, just stripped down to whatever strength still remained. He motioned toward the fire. They gathered near it without a word, their eyes flicking to him, measuring him the way one measures the edge of a blade. Thomas set his jaw and ladled the last of the stew into 6 bowls. The gesture was plain, but in the silence it felt heavier than speech. The first woman took hers with steady hands. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, her hair dark and braided back, her face carved with fatigue, yet steady as stone. Even exhausted, she gave the impression of command. When she finally spoke, her name came with quiet certainty, Saga. The second was younger by a decade, maybe not yet 17. Her foot was wrapped in blood-stained rags, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She avoided his gaze, whispering her name so softly he barely caught it, Tala. Next was a round-faced woman with gentle eyes and quick fingers. She accepted the bowl as though it were something fragile. Kaya, she said, voice low, almost apologetic. Beside her stood another who said little at all. She simply dipped her head, eyes shadowed, before offering her name in a clipped murmur, Naya. Her hands bore calluses, and Thomas noticed the small knife at her belt, the handle smoothed from years of use. Last came the tallest of them, arms folded across her chest, her posture like a guard at a gate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a hard edge, Pia. Their names hung in the air, foreign yet familiar, the sound of people who had survived too much. Thomas set his own bowl down, suddenly aware that every pair of eyes had shifted toward him, waiting. He cleared his throat. Thomas, he said simply, McAllister. That seemed to be enough. They ate in silence, the crackle of firewood filling the space where conversation should have been. Tala's hands shook as she spooned the stew, but she made no sound, no complaint. Saga blew on hers slowly, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. Kaya, careful as a sparrow, tore a piece of bread from her pouch and shared it with the younger girl. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the rifle across his lap, pretending to watch the flames. In truth, he studied them, how each moved, how each guarded something unseen. Not wanderers, he realized, not drifters, survivors. The cabin creaked in the wind, as if groaning beneath the weight of strangers. Thomas felt the silence pressing on him again, but it was no longer empty. It carried 5 names, 5 stories not yet told, and a responsibility he had not chosen. For the first time in years, his meal did not taste like solitude. By morning, the snow had sealed the valley, a thick crust laid over every trail leading out. Thomas rose before dawn as always, the ache in his shoulders familiar from years of chopping wood alone. Yet when he stepped into the main room, he stopped short. The 5 women were still there. Curled in borrowed blankets near the stove, their breathing rose and fell in quiet rhythm. The cabin smelled of wool and smoke and something else, presence. For 6 years he had woken to silence. Now the room felt heavier, fuller, alive. He stoked the fire, poured water into the pot, and set it to boil. The scrape of his boots woke the first of them. Saga pushed herself upright, hair loose over her shoulders, eyes sharp even from sleep. She watched him a long moment before standing to fetch the kettle. Without a word, she measured out grounds from a tin he had set aside, moving as though she had done so 100 times. Soon the others stirred. Kaya folded blankets neatly, her hands quick and practiced. Pia stood at the doorframe, arms crossed, scanning the ridge through the frost-clouded glass as though expecting danger. Naya crouched near the shelves, rearranging what few supplies Thomas owned, lining jars with a care he himself had never given them. Tala sat nearest the fire, her bandaged foot propped on a stool, hands trembling as she tied and untied the frayed cloth. Thomas said nothing. He only watched as they worked, each woman sliding into some unspoken rhythm. No orders were given, no bargains struck, yet the cabin began to change. Curtains patched, loose boards wedged tighter, water drawn without being asked. When breakfast was ready, stew stretched thin with the last of his beans, he placed bowls before them. They ate with the same silence as the night before, but this time something lingered in the air. Not fear, not suspicion, something quieter. As Tala lifted her spoon, Thomas noticed her pause, lips moving without sound. A prayer, perhaps, or the memory of one. The sight caught him off guard. He lowered his head for a moment, the words of his mother's Bible surfacing in his mind. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." The verse slipped through his memory like smoke, and for the first time in years he almost believed it. After they finished, the women did not retreat into stillness. Kaya gathered the bowls, washing them in melted snow. Naya inspected his threadbare coat and began stitching along the shoulder. Pia sharpened her knife, the rasp of stone against metal steady and low. Saga, moving stiff from an unseen wound, stepped outside and began stacking kindling against the wall. Thomas took up his axe, more out of habit than necessity. Yet when he brought it down on a log, he noticed Saga beside him, picking up the split pieces, laying them neatly by the door. She did not ask permission, she simply worked. For a long moment, Thomas let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, he nodded once. Saga met his eyes, gave a brief nod in return, and bent to the task. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, was no longer his alone. And though he told himself it was only for a night or two, something in the air whispered otherwise. The third night settled heavy over the ridge. Snow whispered against the roof, and the fire in the stove glowed red as a heartbeat. Thomas sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wood crackle. Behind him, the women spoke softly among themselves in a tongue he only half understood. It was Saga who broke the distance. She rose from her place near the hearth and crossed to where he sat. Her movements were deliberate, though fatigue bent her shoulders. For a moment she only stood there, the firelight tracing the cut on her cheek, the bruise fading along her jaw. "You wonder who we are," she said at last. Thomas didn't answer, but the question lay plain in his eyes. Saga looked toward the others. Kaya dozed with her head against the wall. Tala curled into a ball, her foot still bound. Pia sat upright by the door, knife in hand. Naya scratched faint lines into a scrap of wood with the point of a nail, lost in silence. "We had a place," Saga continued, "below Fort Garland, a cabin, not much different from this. It was ours." Her voice thinned, but she steadied it. "Some ranchers rode through, drunk. They swore we were hiding warriors, planning ambushes." Her hands flexed against her thighs. It was not true. Our husbands were already gone, taken months before, some in fighting, some by fever. We were only women and children. Thomas shifted, the rifle cold beneath his palms. He had heard this story before, told in different towns, with different faces, always ending the same. "They came at night," Saga said, Fire on the roof, shots through the door. One of ours fell before she even rose from bed. The rest we carried into the hills. By morning, all that was left was smoke." Her eyes met his. They held no plea, only the flat weight of memory. "We walked 5 days in the snow, no shoes, no fire. We followed the smoke from your chimney." Silence stretched, filled only by the pop of sap in the fire. Thomas exhaled slowly. He thought of the treaties he had once translated, the promises signed with ink while blood soaked the ground. He thought of the mothers who had begged for mercy in words no one wanted to hear. "You lost everything," he murmured. Saga gave the faintest nod. "Not everything. We still breathe." Her gaze hardened, not at him, but at the world beyond the window. "But men do not see widows as worth keeping. Not our own people, not yours. To them, we are nothing." Thomas gripped the rifle tighter, not from fear, but from anger that rose against his will. He had seen it before, human lives reduced to rumor and convenience. He thought of his own years in silence, how easily the world discards what no longer serves it. He met Saga's eyes, and for the first time, neither looked away. Behind them, Tala stirred and whispered something in Apache, a word Thomas could not translate. But he recognized its tone. Relief, fragile and fleeting, like the warmth of fire against the cold pressing in on every side. For the first time, Thomas did not feel like an intruder in his own cabin. He felt like a witness. By December, the snow lay shoulder-deep in the hollows. The sky carried a weight of gray that never seemed to lift, and the wind cut sharper each day. The cabin became less a place of retreat and more a fortress against the white silence pressing from every side. Thomas rose early to split wood, his breath pluming like smoke in the brittle air. He was not alone anymore. Saga followed him most mornings, gathering the split pieces with steady hands despite the limp in her stride. She never asked permission, never complained. She simply worked, her breath clouding beside his, her rhythm aligning with his own. Inside, life found new patterns. Kaya kneaded what little flour remained with melted snow and fat, shaping small cakes that browned on the stove's iron plate. The smell, faint as it was, turned the cabin into something more than survival. When Thomas ate one, he nearly startled at the memory it stirred. His mother's bread, long ago, before silence became his company. Naya carved lines into the beams with a sharpened nail. At first, Thomas thought it idle scratching, but when the firelight struck them, he saw figures emerging, curves of animals, patterns of mountains, spirals like wind. She said little, but the walls seemed less bare for her touch. Pia remained the sentinel. She tested the door latch twice each night, sharpened her blade until it sang against the stone. When the wind howled too near, she would stand guard by the threshold, eyes fixed outward, body taut as a bowstring. Tala, youngest of all, struggled with her wound. She shuffled awkwardly, frustration pinching her face as the others moved with purpose. Thomas noticed, and one afternoon he beckoned her to the shed. He showed her how to check traps, how to follow the faint impressions of rabbit feet in snow, how to knot a snare line with trembling fingers. She listened intently, though the pain in her foot made each step falter. When the snare finally caught a hare, her gasp of triumph was so pure that Thomas almost smiled aloud. She carried the prize back herself, proud despite her limp, and the women greeted her with quiet words that needed no translation. The days folded into nights, nights into days, each marked not by solitude, but by the small sounds of life, the scrape of a knife, the murmur of voices, the rustle of blankets near the fire. The cabin's silence no longer pressed like stone, it breathed. One evening, as the snow thickened outside, Thomas sat by the fire sharpening his axe. Saga settled across from him, her dress patched where it had torn, her hands raw from work. She met his gaze evenly. "You live alone too long," she said. It was not a question. Thomas gave a small shrug. "Easier that way." Saga studied him for a moment, then returned to mending a cloak without reply. Yet in that silence, Thomas felt something shift. Easier, yes, but no longer enough. The cabin was changing, and so was he. The knock came just after midday, sharp against the cabin door. For an instant, the room froze. The scrape of Kaya's knife halted mid-cut. Naya's hand paused above her carving. Even the fire seemed to hush. Pia was the first to move, stepping forward with her blade drawn, eyes flashing to Thomas. He set down the log he had been splitting and crossed the room. His hand hovered at the rifle propped near the wall before he opened the door. A man stood outside, his coat dusted white with snow. He looked no older than 30, cheeks ruddy from the cold, a brass star pinned crookedly to his chest. He carried no horse, no wagon, only a pistol at his side and an expression that mixed duty with curiosity. "Afternoon," the man said, his breath fogging in the air. "Name's Denton, deputy out of Wolf Hollow. I'm tracking 2 stolen mules. Thought maybe they came this way." Thomas kept his body angled, blocking the sight of the women within. "Ain't seen any stock pass through," he replied evenly. Denton tilted his head, peering past Thomas's shoulder. "Funny, thought I saw tracks leading up this ridge. Smoke, too? You livin' up here alone?" Thomas's jaw tightened. Behind him, he sensed the women's stillness, the kind of silence born of prey pressed to ground. He shifted just enough to obscure the firelit shapes in the cabin. "Been on my own near 6 years," Thomas said. "Only company's goats and snow." Denton studied him. His eyes lingered on the fresh wood stacked by the wall, the faint prints in the snow near the shed, the curtain recently mended. Signs of more than one hand at work. "You've got busy goats," Denton muttered. His smile carried no warmth. For a moment, Thomas considered the rifle. Instead, he forced his shoulders to loosen. "Winter's long, a man keeps busy." The deputy's gaze flicked once more toward the window, where a shadow shifted, a thin outline of Kaya moving the stew pot. His smile sharpened. "Strange. Looks like you're not the only one keeping warm." Thomas stepped closer, the cold air biting his throat. His voice dropped. "Whatever you think you see, you don't. Cabin's mine, food's mine, no fugitives here." Denton studied him, the silence stretching taut. Then he shrugged, snow falling from his shoulders. "Maybe so. Still, I'll be back through in a week, just making sure things up here are proper." He turned, boots crunching in the snow, and walked back down the ridge. Thomas closed the door slowly, the latch clicking like a gunshot. Inside, the women had not moved. Tala's eyes were wide, Kaya's hands pressed tight around the ladle. Pia still gripped her knife, knuckles white. Selah rose, her face unreadable. "He saw us," she said. Thomas nodded once, throat tight. He saw enough. The fire popped, the sound startling in the silence. For the first time since they arrived, the cabin no longer felt hidden. It felt marked. The cabin stayed hushed long after the deputy's footsteps vanished into the snow. Every creak of timber, every whistle of wind against the eaves felt sharper, louder, as though the valley itself now listened. Tala sat curled by the fire, her bandaged foot drawn close. Naya stood at the window, eyes narrowed, as if watching for shadows among the pines. Pia never moved from the door, her knife resting across her knees. Selah broke the silence. "We should leave." Her voice was calm, but Thomas heard the weight beneath it. He set aside the rifle and shook his head. "Storm's too deep. Tracks would follow you for miles. He'd find you faster on open ground than here." Selah studied him, unreadable. "Then we wait for spring?" Thomas met her eyes. "If you want, but if you walk now, you won't last a week." No one spoke. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dim air. Finally, Kaya set her sewing aside and whispered, "Where would we go? No tribe will take us back. No town will have us." Her voice broke on the last word, but she did not weep. Thomas rose and crossed the room. From beneath his bed he pulled a small chest, the wood scarred and darkened by years. Inside lay old papers, folded and stained with oil, and a notary seal from Canyon Post.
He set them on the table with deliberate care. "What are these?" Selah asked. "My land records," Thomas said. His voice was low, steady. "Every acre I built here. The county believes what's written more than what's true, so we'll give them writing." He drew out a blank sheet, the ink bottle nearly dry. He dipped the quill, the scratch of nib against parchment cutting through the silence. One by one, he wrote their names as they had given them: Selah, Tala, Kaya, Naya, Pia. His hand was careful, as though each letter carved permanence into wood. Beside them he wrote, "Assistants and residents of the McAllister Homestead, Colorado Territory." He pressed the seal into the page, the wax spreading dark and final.
When he lifted it, the imprint remained, rough but official enough for any clerk who cared to ask. Thomas slid the paper across the table. Selah stared at it a long moment. Her fingers brushed the seal as though testing its reality. "This makes us yours?" Thomas shook his head. "It makes you lawful, not ghosts, not strays. It gives you a place the law can't deny." Selah exhaled, shoulders sagging. Kaya stepped forward next, her eyes wet, though she did not cry. Pia glanced once at Thomas, then back to the door, her grip on the knife loosening for the first time. Tala reached out last. Her hand trembled as she touched the parchment, lips moving silently. Thomas didn't need the words. He had once heard the same in church pews long ago. A prayer of thanks too deep for sound. For the first time since they had arrived, the women were not simply surviving in his cabin. They belonged. And Thomas McAllister, who had sworn himself to silence, felt the weight of family settle on his shoulders once again. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the wind was already howling down from the ridge, rattling shutters and forcing smoke back down the chimney. By nightfall, the valley was a prison of white. Snow piled high against the door, sealing it shut as if the mountain itself had decided they would not leave. The roof groaned under the weight. The old timbers creaked with every gust, as though testing how long they could hold. Inside, the fire sputtered low. Thomas fed it sparingly, counting the split logs stacked by the wall. Too few. The pile would not last the week if they burned freely. Rationing began at once. Half portions of food, careful handfuls of wood. Pia kept her station at the door, checking the latch each time the wind shook it. Kaya measured the flour with trembling hands, eking out flat cakes from a dusting of grain and melted snow. Naya scraped frost from the windows, carving tiny vents so the glass would not crack under the ice. Tala huddled close to the stove, her bandaged foot propped on a stool. She shivered violently, but when Thomas draped a blanket across her shoulders, she whispered, "Gracias," and clutched it as if it were armor. Selah worked alongside Thomas, her dark hair unbound, strands plastered to her face with sweat from hauling buckets of snow inside to melt. She did not complain when her hands bled from the cold, only pressed on. For days, they moved as a single machine. When the wind howled, they braced the walls together. When the roof groaned, Thomas climbed the rafters with Pia to shore it with spare beams. When the fire shrank, Kaya and Naya stripped bark to feed the flames. Yet amid the strain, something else grew. Laughter, small, surprising, born from exhaustion, slipped into the silence. Tala giggled when a sudden gust knocked Thomas's hat clean off. Kaya hummed a tune from childhood while stirring thin broth. Even Naya allowed herself a smile as she carved a spiral into the wood, declaring softly, "Storm passes, always." At night, when the wind screamed like a living thing, they pressed close around the fire. The crackling warmth on their faces became more than heat. It was proof they still breathed, still resisted the white void outside. Thomas looked at them, their shoulders bent, their faces hollow with hunger, and felt the weight of choice. Before, he had survived winters by silence alone. Now, he survived by their hands beside his. The blizzard had locked them in, but it had also bound them together. Thomas rested his hand on the rifle, eyes on the quivering door. There would be no leaving, no running, not now. Whatever storm waited beyond these walls, snow, men, or fate itself, they would face it here. There was no turning back. The storm did not relent. By the second week, the world outside had vanished into white. No trails, no sky, only a shifting curtain of snow that swallowed the trees whole. The cabin became the universe, every sound amplified by the wind's ceaseless cry. Thomas worked by instinct. He split wood, mended tools, kept the stove alive. But he was no longer moving in solitude. Wherever he turned, Saga seemed near. Carrying buckets, binding rafters, kneeling beside him to mend a crack in the wall. It was not words that passed between them, but small, unguarded gestures. When she brushed hair from her face, her fingers grazed the scar near her temple. Thomas noticed how her hand lingered, as though measuring what pain remained. When he lifted the axe, her gaze flicked to the old scar along his forearm, carved there years ago by another man's blade. Neither spoke of their wounds, yet both seemed to read them in silence. One night, when the fire burned low, Saga settled opposite him, the others already asleep in their blankets. The room glowed dim, shadows stretching across her face. She studied him openly, without shame. "You carry silence like a shield," she said at last. Her voice was steady, quiet enough not to wake the others. Thomas met her eyes but gave no reply. He did not trust words. They were too heavy, too final. Saga leaned closer to the fire, her hands spread to the warmth. The skin of her knuckles was cracked, raw from cold, yet her posture remained unbent. Thomas found himself watching the rise of her breath, the stubborn line of her jaw. When their eyes met again, it was not with suspicion, it was recognition. Later, as the storm pressed against the walls, he rose to check the latch. Saga followed. They stood side by side at the door, listening to the groan of wood against the gale. She glanced up at him then, close enough that he could feel the brush of her sleeve against his arm. For a moment, neither moved. Her presence carried a weight different from the storm outside, less violent, yet no less unstoppable. She did not speak again, and neither did he. But when they returned to the fire, she lay down nearer to him than before, her blanket brushing the toe of his boot. It was not touch, not yet, but it was the first crack in the silence he had built around himself for years. And Thomas realized, with a jolt both terrifying and strange, that he no longer minded the sound of another's breath beside his own. The storm reached its height on the third night. The wind screamed through the rafters, shaking the cabin so fiercely that snow sifted through the cracks in the roof beams. The fire burned low, its light painting every face in flickering gold. Thomas sat watch in his chair, rifle across his knees, though there was nothing to shoot at but shadows and wind. The women slept close together, a knot of blankets near the stove. All but Saga. She rose quietly, her steps soft against the floorboards. For a moment she only stood there, her figure framed by the firelight, before she crossed to him. "You do not sleep," she said. Thomas shook his head. "Not when the roof sounds ready to give." Saga's lips curved faintly, but there was no mirth in it. She drew nearer, her gaze steady on his. "You keep watch for us." He did not answer. Words felt dangerous with her this close. Saga knelt beside his chair, her hands resting on her knees. In the firelight, he saw the thin scar at her collarbone, the lines of weariness etched into her face. Yet her eyes burned with something unbroken. "You think silence keeps you safe," she murmured, "but silence is another kind of prison." Thomas looked away, the old ache in his chest pressing hard. He thought of years lost to solitude, of nights spent listening only to wind and memory. Her hand moved, hesitated, then rested lightly on his forearm. The touch was tentative, testing. He did not flinch. For a long breath, they remained like that, the storm raging around them, the fire hissing low. Then Saga leaned closer. The kiss was not hurried, it was not desperate. It was the steady meeting of two lives worn thin, two souls that had endured too much alone. Her lips were warm against his, tasting faintly of smoke and bitter coffee. When she drew back, her eyes searched his as though bracing for rejection. Instead, Thomas whispered, hoarse and quiet, "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." The words startled him even as they left his lips, a verse his mother once read by lamplight, long forgotten until this moment. Now it returned, as if waiting for this night, this woman. Saga did not know the scripture, but she heard the weight in his voice. Slowly, she touched the scar at his jaw, tracing it as though memorizing him. Then she settled near the fire, lying so close that their hands nearly touched. Thomas did not move for a long while. He only watched the storm batter the world outside and felt something shift inside his chest. Not silence, not solitude, hope. The storm broke as suddenly as it had come. After days of wind and white, the valley lay silent beneath a pale sun, the snow glittering like broken glass. For the first time in weeks, the air did not howl, it whispered. Thomas stepped outside with Saga at his side. The cold stung his lungs, but the stillness was more unsettling than the storm. Snowdrifts towered against the cabin walls, and the roof sagged under a frozen crust. He carried a shovel, she carried nothing but her eyes, sharp as a hawk's. It was she who saw it first. Near the north fence line, half buried in powder, a set of tracks curved along the edge of the trees. Not deer, not rabbit, human. Thomas knelt, brushing frost from the imprint. The heel was deep, the stride measured. Whoever it was had circled wide and never approached the cabin directly. Watching, not visiting. Saga crouched beside him, her breath a thin cloud. The deputy? Maybe. Thomas's jaw tightened. Or someone worse. They followed the trail as far as they dared. The prints led toward the ridge, where shadows pooled thick between the pines. There the snow swallowed them whole, leaving no end to chase. Thomas scanned the tree line, every muscle taut. The silence pressed on his ears like a warning. Back at the cabin, the women gathered as he laid the news before them. Pia's hand went straight to her knife. Kaya clasped Tala close, whispering comfort the girl did not believe. Naya stared at the floorboards, her thumb rubbing a fresh carving, a spiral etched deeper than the others, as though to anchor herself. "They know we're here," Saga said flatly. Thomas nodded. "Whoever it is, they've marked us." The room fell heavy. For weeks they had been hidden by snow, unseen by the world. Now the world had peered back. Thomas set the rifle on the table. "We prepare. If they come, they won't find us soft." The hours that followed were filled with motion. Pia checked the locks on every shutter, driving nails deeper with a hammer. Kaya gathered herbs into cloth bundles for quick poultices. Naya sharpened stakes and placed them at the shed door. Even Tala, though still limping, helped strip bark for tinder. Saga worked beside Thomas, repairing the axe handle, testing its weight in her hands. She glanced at him once, and he caught the flicker in her gaze. Not fear, not surrender, but readiness. By nightfall, the cabin was quieter than usual. No laughter, no humming, only the sound of the fire gnawing wood. Yet beneath the silence lay something stronger than dread: resolve. Thomas sat by the window, watching the line of trees darken with dusk. Somewhere out there, someone waited. He rested his hand on the rifle, the same way he once rested it on silence. But now, when he glanced back at the 5 women bent to their tasks, he knew he was no longer alone in the fight. Night pressed heavy after the discovery of the tracks. The fire glowed low, shadows flickering against the walls. Every sound beyond the cabin, the crack of ice, the shift of snow, felt like footsteps drawing closer. Thomas sat near the stove, oiling the rifle with slow, steady hands. Saga lingered by the window, her silhouette etched against the frost-lit pane. She had stood there a long time, too long, watching the trees as though expecting them to move. At last she spoke, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "It is not death I fear."
Thomas looked up, his hand stilling on the rag. Selah turned, her dark eyes meeting his. "I have seen death. I have buried it with my own hands. What I fear," she paused, searching for words, "is losing this." Her gaze swept the cabin, the women asleep under blankets, Kaya's mending left half-finished, Naya's carvings gleaming in the firelight. Her voice tightened. "We are 5 widows. We were nothing. Yet here," she touched the edge of the table, her hand trembling, "we are something again, a family." Thomas swallowed hard. He understood too well. Years alone had hollowed him, carved out the marrow of belonging. Now, for the first time, his cabin pulsed with life again. The thought of losing it, losing them, hollowed him in a different way. Selah stepped closer, her face half in shadow. "If they come, they will not see women who survived. They will see only what they choose, strays, outcasts, prey, and they will tear this from us." Thomas set the rifle aside and rose. The distance between them vanished in 2 steps. "Not while I breathe." Selah searched his face, as if testing the weight of his words. "You would stand for us? I already have." His voice was rough, steady. "And I will again. Not because you are helpless, but because you are mine now. All of you. Not possessions," he shook his head, "but family. And I will not let family be taken." For the first time, Selah's strength wavered. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She pressed her palm to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded strong and certain. "You speak as if you believe it," she whispered. "I do." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the air. Selah let out a slow breath, as though releasing a weight she had carried since the night their refuge burned. She leaned her forehead against his chest, her voice a whisper almost lost to the storm outside. "Then I am not afraid." Thomas lowered his hand over hers, sealing the vow. In that moment, no blizzard, no deputy, no shadow in the trees felt stronger than the bond forged between them. The storm returned that night, though softer than before. Snow hissed against the roof, the wind sighing through the eaves. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, casting the room in a dim orange glow. The others had drifted to sleep, their breathing a chorus of weary peace. Thomas remained by the fire, sharpening his knife more from habit than need. Selah sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, eyes reflecting the flames. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but alive, thick with things unspoken yet understood. At last, Selah rose. She crossed the room without hesitation and stopped before him. Her shadow fell across his boots, her presence filling the space. "You keep watch," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "It's what I know." She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the whetstone from his hands. "Then let me keep watch over you." The knife clattered softly onto the table as her hands slid to his shoulders. Thomas froze, not from fear, but from the weight of what her touch carried. For years he had braced against loneliness like a shield. Now the shield fell, and he found no desire to lift it again. Selah leaned forward, her lips meeting his with the same steady resolve as before. But this kiss was deeper, warmer. It was not a question this time, it was an answer. He drew her into his arms, feeling the strength of her body pressed against him, the life that pulsed through her despite every loss she had endured. Her fingers traced the scars along his jaw, his neck, his chest, as if mapping the man he had become. He held her not with hunger, but with reverence, as though she were something sacred placed in his keeping. When they lay together near the fire, it was not desperation that guided them, but tenderness. Each movement was slow, careful, an unspoken vow in the dark. Their union was not the taking of comfort, but the giving of it, 2 lives weaving into one fabric at last.
Afterward, Selah rested her head against his chest, her breath steady, her hand splayed across his heart. For years, Thomas had feared the sound of another's breathing beside his own, but now he found it was the only sound he wanted. The fire dimmed, the storm whispered outside, but within the cabin there was no fear, only warmth. Thomas closed his eyes, his hand stroking Selah's hair. He did not pray aloud, but in the silence of his heart he offered thanks. For her, for this night, for the family that had taken root in a place once barren. The storm might rise again, men might come with badges and guns, but he no longer faced them alone. In her embrace, he found not only love, but home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. By February, the storms began to ease. The sky, once a lid of iron, cracked open with streaks of pale blue. Snowmelt whispered down the slopes, trickling into streams that had slept under ice for months. The valley stirred, reluctant but alive again. Thomas stood on the porch, shovel in hand, watching rivulets carve paths through the drifts. Behind him came the muffled sounds of life. Kaya humming while tending the pot, Tala laughing softly as Naya teased her about her limp, Pia's knife tapping rhythmically against wood as she whittled. Selah emerged from the cabin, her shawl drawn tight, eyes scanning the horizon. "You're listening," she said, noticing the way he held still. Thomas nodded. "The land's waking up." Selah followed his gaze across the valley. "So are we." The thaw brought work. Corrals needed mending where snow had bowed the rails. Roof shingles had loosened, demanding repairs before the spring rains came. The goats, restless after weeks in confinement, bleated eagerly to be led into the pasture. The cabin, once silent stone and timber, now thrummed with movement, voices, and purpose. It was during those days that Thomas realized something had changed deep within himself. He no longer thought in terms of I, but we. Every task, every decision, he weighed not against his own survival, but theirs. And they, in turn, moved with the same quiet rhythm around him. One morning, Selah joined him in the shed as he sharpened tools. She laid a hand on the workbench, watching him in the pale light that streamed through cracks in the wall. "They will come again," she said. It was not a question. Thomas paused, the whetstone stilling. "Maybe." "If they do," Selah continued, "we must stand together." He set down the blade, looking into her eyes. "That's already decided." She nodded once, as though sealing a pact. Then, without another word, she picked up a hammer and joined him in the work. By late March, rumors had reached Canyon Post. Reed McAllister, the recluse in the hills, was no longer alone. A man at the post office swore he'd seen Apache women buying cloth and salt. Another muttered about harboring strays. Yet when the clerk rode out to the homestead, he found papers signed, sealed, and filed. Assistants, legal residents, every name accounted for. The law could mutter, the townsfolk could whisper, but nothing could be undone. One evening, as the last frost clung to the meadow, Thomas sat on the porch with Selah beside him. The sun dropped gold across the ridge, casting their shadows long and joined. The others busied themselves inside, laughter spilling through the door. Selah rested her hand on her lap, fingers brushing his. "They will never understand," she murmured. Thomas squeezed her hand lightly. "They don't need to." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Selah leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice softer than the breeze. "We are home." Thomas closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words sink deep. The silence around them was no longer emptiness. It was fullness, of life, of family, of faith in what they had built. He thought of a verse he had once heard long ago, carried now in memory like a flame. God sets the lonely in families. Psalm 68:6. He had never understood it before. Now, with Selah's hand in his, he did. The valley exhaled in thaw. The cabin stood firm. And for the first time in years, Thomas McAllister no longer feared tomorrow. Spring deepened, softening the edges of winter's scars. Grass pushed up through patches of thawed earth, and the streams sang louder each day.
The cabin no longer felt like a shelter against emptiness. It had become a hearth, alive with voices and work. One morning, Thomas led the goats into the meadow with Pia and Tala following. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. Behind them, Selah's voice carried faintly from the cabin, calling instructions to Kaya as she baked. For the first time in years, Thomas realized he was no longer walking toward solitude. He was walking out into a world shared. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in copper and rose, Thomas set down his tools and faced Selah. She stood at the water's edge, washing clothes in a wooden basin, the sleeves of her dress rolled up, droplets glinting on her skin. He crossed the clearing, his heart pounding with a weight he had never carried before. She looked up as his shadow fell across the basin. "You breathe like a man about to climb a mountain," she teased gently. "Maybe I am," Thomas replied. His voice was steadier than he felt. Selah tilted her head, studying him. "Then speak, before the mountain grows taller." He took her hands, rough from work but strong, and held them tightly. "Marry me," he said. "Not for the law, not for protection. For us, for this life we've made." For a moment she was still. Then a smile, small but radiant, softened her face. "I thought you'd never ask." 2 days later, beneath the tall spruce that had sheltered the cabin since its building, they stood together with the others gathered close. Pia crossed her arms, but her eyes gleamed with rare approval. Kaya wove a braid into Selah's hair, while Tala scattered wildflowers at their feet. Naya carved a circle into the bark of the spruce, a mark of permanence, of unity. Thomas spoke simply, his words carrying more weight than any sermon. "You stay with me, and I stay with you." Selah's reply was just as plain, yet strong enough to echo in their hearts. "Then we stay." No preacher, no papers, only earth, sky, and witnesses bound by survival and love. And it was enough. That night, as laughter and song drifted from the cabin, Thomas and Selah sat together on the porch. She leaned into him, her back warm against his chest, his arms secure around her waist. The land stretched wide and quiet before them, no longer hostile but promising. Her hand rested lightly on her belly. Thomas noticed, his breath catching. She turned her head slightly, her lips near his ear. "In a few months," she whispered. For a moment he could not speak. Fear flickered, fear of the world's judgment, of the dangers yet to come. But then he looked at her, felt her strength, and the fear ebbed away. "They won't understand," he murmured. "They don't need to," Selah answered with quiet certainty. Thomas gazed out across the meadow, where the first shoots of corn Selah had planted were breaking through the soil. Life from the earth, fragile yet defiant. He pressed his lips to her hair, whispering a prayer he had not spoken in years. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Psalm 23:1. The words steadied him, anchoring him to something greater than the world's whispers. Inside, Tala's laughter rose again. Kaya hummed a tune. Naya's knife scratched softly as she carved another symbol into wood. And Pia, ever watchful, closed the shutters with a firmness that meant safety. The cabin was no longer a refuge for one man, nor a hiding place for outcasts. It was a home, their home. And in the glow of twilight, with Selah in his arms and the sound of family within, Thomas McAllister finally understood what he had been given. Not just survival, not just companionship, but grace. As the last light fades over the Colorado Valley, we are reminded that the frontier was never only about guns or gold. It was about hearts learning to endure, to forgive, and to love again. Thomas and Selah's journey is more than fiction. It echoes the silent strength of countless men and women who carved homes out of wilderness, who found family where the world saw none. Perhaps you too remember days of struggle or the quiet ache of loneliness. Stories like these remind us that even in the harshest winters of life, grace can find us and love can still bloom. If this tale stirred your heart, let us know where you're watching from and share your own memories in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more true Wild West stories, tales of resilience, faith, and the enduring hope that still speaks across the years.